JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Google, Meta and Lyft. They and many other big firms want their employees back in the office. Are we seeing the end of remote working? And can the city survive if workers don't return to their desks? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, at the height of the COVID pandemic, many companies thought it would be impossible for their staff to work from home. But they faced the stark choice: embrace remote working or shut down. It worked better than many could have imagined. But now those exact same firms are facing another problem: empty offices and skyrocketing rents. So what's the impact of the work from home revolution on cities and their economies?
This is Belgian IT coach Yves Hanul. During the pandemic, Yves and millions like him everywhere adapted to working from home. But as remote working took off, city centres became ghost towns. This was the City of London in 2020. Now, as the pandemic recedes and workers return to offices, many are reluctant to entirely give up the advantages of working from home. According to WFH research, a group that includes Stanford University and Germany's IFO Institute, the English-speaking world leads other regions in the amount of time spent per week working remotely. People in Canada, the UK and the US spend around 1.5 days a week away from the office. And the majority of remote working happens in industries linked to information, finance and other professional services. But even with nearly 4 years' worth of data, the jury remains out on the effects of remote working both on individuals and the broader economy. According to WFH research, people save 72 minutes a day on average globally while working from home. But other data suggests a drop in productivity when staff spend all their time out of the office. Meanwhile, some companies are voting with their feet. Banking giant HSBC said in June it plans to move out of its global headquarters in London's Canary Wharf in favour of smaller premises because of remote working. In the power play between employers and employees, who will win the battle over hybrid work?
Well, we've got a fantastic panel on this today. Ben Marks, the founder and CEO of the Work Anywhere campaign, an advocacy group which champions the right to work remotely. Phil Ryan, Director of City Futures at the property consultancy firm JLL. Joining us in London is Simon Blair, founder and CEO of SHB Real Estate. And in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in the US is Vrinda Mittal, Assistant Professor of Finance at the University of North Carolina. Welcome to Roundtable to all of you. Simon, I want to come to you first. Just paint us a picture of the commercial property market in London over the past couple of years and what the working from home revolution has done to it.
Thanks for having me, Enda. I think when we came back from the pandemic, there was an expectation for habits to change completely in London when it came to the usefulness and the future of the office. London was extremely empty. But it's got progressively busier since returning from the pandemic until, right now what we're seeing is clients of ours are working 3, 4, and in some cases 5-day weeks. It's just very location dependent and specific of what industry we're referring to. So if you go to the West End of London, the streets are as busy as they've ever been, which is a relief to the local retailers. And all the transport companies. And I think the working from home habits are down to as low as, a couple of days a month, maybe 1 day a week at most. But if you go over to the city, still the investment banks, insurance companies are still being very relaxed about working from home habits. And in many cases, people are only coming into the office 1, 2, possibly 3 times a week. So working from home hasn't settled down yet. But it's certainly looking good for London right now.
Frinda, Zoom recently told their staff to get back to the office. We've seen HSBC in London announce they're pulling out of Canary Wharf. They're wanting to reduce their global office space by 40%. What happens when big companies downsize like this?
No, I think that's a very important question, and we've been seeing this in the UK and the US that a lot of companies don't want to, renew their office space, and I mean the amount of revenues which these landowners are getting from the tenants have been going down over time, so I mean I think it's a tough market for the future. As Simon pointed out, that there are some amounts of remote work which is still happening, across different industries and across different types of spaces. Now, whether it's 2 days or 3 days a week, I think we still have to see. But the important point is that, some amount of remote work is here to stay. And this definitely has repercussions for retailers around, for those who finance these office loans, like the banks, and for the investors in office as well.
Ben, I want to turn to you. You run a campaign called Work Anywhere. So thanks for actually coming in to talk to me today. I was half expecting you to pop up remotely.
No problem.
Have we changed the way we work forever? I mean, is this it now?
I think so. I think the genie is out of the bottle. Nick Bloom from Stanford University says full-time office work is dead. Yes, there's a lot of variation across industry and across even continents in terms of the uptake of this. But I mean, in the US, I think 27% of the workforce are currently working remotely. That's roughly 5 times the pre-pandemic levels. And I think that, people over the last few years have experienced what it's like to work remotely. They spent more time with their families. They've reduced their cost of living. They've perhaps living somewhere where they have a better connection with nature. And now they understand that they can be just as productive doing that, and they don't want to come back.
Phil, that's quite a quote, isn't it? Full-time office working is dead. Have we changed our working habits forever now?
We have, but not as binary of a choice as work 5 days in the office and 5 days remotely. We're figuring out what that balance is. 3 to 4 days is probably the most likely. I come in 5 days a week personally, but I see that ebb and flow throughout the week on my tube commute, particularly since I go through a major commuter hub. And I see Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it feels like pre-pandemic. Monday and Friday may be a bit different. But most people still want some time in the office. They like having that place that brings them with their coworkers. They like having a sense of place, somewhere that's focused on working and making connections, and really that space that allows for people to do things that maybe aren't work-related, but are places for training, building relationships, career progression, and so on.
Phil, do you think there's friction between bosses and employees, that bosses really, they want to see people to believe they're working in person?
I do think that there is a bit of trust that does build up from in-person connections, absolutely. I think some of the friction is a bit exaggerated, and there are certainly, not all bosses are micromanagers or need to see everyone in all the time. But obviously there are always going to be differences of perspective within that balance, and it's about finding that leverage and adjusting to newer ways of management.
Ben, who wins that battle then if workers don't want to go back to the office 5 days a week?
I think, ultimately there's been a lot of pressure on businesses to try to drive people back. A lot of them don't want to take a cold, hard look at their processes and figure out how to adjust to the new world of work. But I think that long term, especially now, if you're going to try to leverage the weak economy to coerce people to come back when they don't want to, that's not a good long-term strategy. People don't want to do it. A survey by FlexJobs found that 97% of workers want some form of remote or hybrid work in the future. To your point, it's not a binary between remote, or in the office full-time. But according to Nick Bloom from Stanford, roughly a third of workers want 100% full-time office work. And it's worth considering as well that the majority of new firms are overwhelmingly remote. So if you want an indication of where things are going in the future, you sort of want to look at them. And one other thing I'd say as well is that the underlying technologies that enable distributed work, the tools, the products, the processes, are going to get exponentially better over time. As remote work gets better, you iron out some of the problems, more people will do it.
Simon, are you picking up on any friction from company CEOs and bosses who are coming to you looking for commercial property space and have reluctant employees who don't want to be in London 4 or 5 days a week?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we returned from the pandemic, one of the problems was that employers felt that they didn't have the leverage or the power to encourage their workforces back. There was a real fear that people would leave in droves because unemployment was so low. Employees were demanding, really significant uplifts in salary in general terms. I mean, the reality is what we're seeing now is that unemployment's almost doubled in the last, 7 or 8, 9 months. And there are real concerns about the economy, and the employer is beginning to take power back, which that sounds dramatic, but I just think that it's balancing up again. And the things that we're seeing from our clients across, a whole different spectrum of sizes of businesses and industries, is that they need their staff to be collaborative and working towards the idea of brand, both for the benefit of the business, but also for the benefit of the individuals. Because you learn from other people. You really can't. I'm not by any means saying there isn't a place for working from home. I think there is, but I think the balance between how many days that is and what the benefit is to the individual and the business is still yet to be found, and we're certainly moving towards that now.
Vrinda, in the United States, are you picking up on any friction between bosses and employees about where they need to be every day?
I mean, definitely. We see this in the news all the time that employees don't want to come back to work. And so what we also see that couple of, you can think about the big employers, like, for example, Google, right? There is this concept of amenitization of the office space, or a flight to quality argument, which I also show in my recent work, which is work from home and the office real estate apocalypse, that now probably the newer buildings, or the buildings which have those amenities, are kind of surviving, and that is what also employers are using, people to leveraging that to get people back to work, and probably the older and the stranded office class is taking the hit.
Let's take a look at some statistics from the consultancy group McKinsey. They came out with this recently, and according to their survey, 58% of employees surveyed said their productivity increased due to hybrid work. 54% said that inclusion and diversity in the workplace improved. And meanwhile, 45% said they feel more engaged with their jobs while working remotely. Ben, is this something you've picked up on?
Yes, I think the productivity piece is controversial. How do you define productivity? And I think that you can look at different studies. Some say workers are more productive, some say workers are less. But what that's ultimately telling you is how productive was this group of workers with a specific set of technologies in a specific company, in a specific industry at a specific time, right? Ultimately, that's only going to tell you so much. I think ultimately, if you want to look at how productive remote work is, can, or should be, you need to look at the best-in-class examples. So, for example, Spotify, 18 months after announcing their work from anywhere policy, reported higher turnover. And then you have a number of organizations who have emerged in the last 4 years, who have reached multi-billion-dollar valuations, who have always been remote, have never had an office. That's a pretty difficult thing to do if you're not productive. I think the diversity piece is a lot more clear-cut. The impact on diversity, equity, inclusion has been astronomical. In the US Bureau of Labor Statistics is now reporting that people with disabilities are experiencing unprecedented rates of employment. And I think that for us as a campaign, we really want that to be front and center of the conversation, because whether you have a disability, you're a parent, a carer, a refugee, or basically anyone in the world that didn't win the geographic lottery in terms of where you were born, remote work can equate to access to work, which is a fundamental human right. And what drop in productivity allows you to ethically justify blocking millions of people from employment? Is it 1%, 5%, 10%? My opinion, I think, is evident in the question. And so I think that the diversity piece is conveniently left out of the conversation quite a lot of the time. And I think that it would be good if it's more front and center.
Phil, what do you think? Are people more productive at home?
I would personally posit that they're slightly more productive at the office, just logistically speaking. If I have someone who's working next to me or down the hall and I can ask them a quick question, it's easier than waiting and possibly missing, let's say, a Teams notification or an email. I'm sure there are people who are. I think any sort of self-reported survey regarding productivity is going to be a bit biased, and I'm not sure how you would actually quantify it that much. I would say, though, that we have plenty of examples from major companies that have done very thorough analyses. I know Microsoft was one of them, that showed the level of burnout that was happening in isolation that came from working from home. I, during the first part of the pandemic, worked out of a very small apartment in Manhattan, and I never want to go back to that. It was very claustrophobic and isolating, and not having that support group, and having moved across an ocean and being now, in the office, I can actually meet coworkers and build those types of relationships, and I wouldn't have that same stuff without that sense of place.
Simon, where do you sit on productivity? Do you feel your team contribute more when they're actually in front of you, or are you comfortable? Do you trust them enough to sit at home and still get the job done?
I think the trigger movement is always towards trust, but I think undoubtedly what's happened since the pandemic is that working from home, unless you can provide some very clear KPI analytics, it's quite an easy thing for people to take advantage of. If you take Fridays, for example, now that companies are really feeling the pinch due to the economy in the UK and in particular London, you're seeing that companies are starting to focus on where their businesses are falling down, where they're lacking that productivity, and it's more often than not on Fridays. And that's because people are going out slightly later and longer on Thursdays. They're, treating Friday a bit less seriously. Now that's not to say that people can't be trusted in certain places, in certain situations, because they can. But the KPIs and the analytics need to be put in place, because that's for the benefit of the individuals and their own progression, and also the businesses. So yes and no, but left to their own devices, I think, unfortunately, people do take advantage. It's just the way that we're built.
Human nature. Vrinda, I want to read to you a quote Elon Musk said recently in an interview. Musk says it's morally wrong for laptop classes living in La La Land to work from home. I mean, I guess a billionaire boss, he's going to drive people back to the office himself, isn't he, quite literally?
I mean, it really depends on, the type of industry you're working in, and the type of kind of the amenities you have at home, and also the day of the week. So I hear the quote, but I mean, maybe Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, people come in, they talk, they discuss, they reconvene. And so that's productive. And then Mondays and Fridays, they work from home, and probably they can do other jobs or do this more efficiently depending on the space they have at home. So really, I think that's a very strong statement, right? But probably the optimal is somewhere in the middle.
We've discussed the impact on cities and potential damage, but is there an opportunity here for rural areas that have been struggling for years? Let's take a look at this quote. This is from Marcus Anderson. He's CEO of Future Place Leadership, which is based in Stockholm. He says there is an unprecedented chance in Europe to save many rural areas. Many of them are on the brink of bankruptcy. They can't survive as functioning places or functioning administrations. And this is a really great opportunity, because they are now attracting the very people they need to attract, those that have kids are on their way to starting a family. I mean, Ben, do you think this is an amazing opportunity to breathe life into more rural areas?
Absolutely. I think our way of life and the nature of cities and areas is evolving, and it's certainly that, historically commercial areas, downtown areas are going to take a hit and are going to need to transform. I think a report by KPMG came out recently that they predicted that $800 billion in value is going to get wiped off the value of commercial real estate in major cities by 2030. So it's really no surprise that we're seeing this pushback and this actually quite immense lobbying effort to discredit flexible working and limit people's freedom and autonomy in their choices. But yes, theoretically and actually in practice, anything that these areas lose can be gained by local areas. A report came out in Ireland that found that remote work by reversing brain drain, that is, people able to stay where they're from and access a meaningful career, was boosting the average salary in these areas by 9,000 euros. Now, it's difficult to overstate how impactful that can be in terms of local development, community development, and people's personal well-being and their families.
And that filters down, of course.
Absolutely, and has all sorts of effects. I mean, we don't have enough time to get into it, but even by revivifying a local way of life, we could actually start to bring people back together again and start to re-emphasize that local living, which could have major implications, positive implications for mental health.
Phil, surely the success of remote working, if you live in a rural area, depends on the strength of your broadband.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of serious questions related to infrastructure provision, institutional provision. One of the big challenges in a lot of rural areas, for instance, is healthcare. And if we have, for instance, a rural healthcare shortage and doctor shortages, then we will struggle to retain people if they don't feel that they can even get basic services. There's also concerns about environmental damage from population growth in rural locations. And I would also kind of dispute the idea that we can't have communities within urban areas. I have lived for years in cities. I have very much what I think is a local community and a broader urban community. That level of being able to build support networks easily, have a lot of opportunity in terms of upward mobility and choices from where I come to work is unprecedented in a global city compared to somewhere smaller outside. That doesn't mean that they can't benefit from it, but I think, broadly speaking, the world is still urbanizing.
But do you dispute the fact that loneliness levels are at an all-time high? That's essentially what all the data is suggesting, and so there must be some reason for that.
I don't think that moving to a small town in the countryside would make me any less lonely.
Yeah, I think just to step into that, I don't see how working at home would help that particular issue. Like, there's being on your own at home, coming from personal experience, both with people who work for me, clients and friends all over the place who aren't integrating back to the workplace in some meaningful way. They're largely speaking far more unhappy because they've got disconnected with being busy and in places where they're connecting with more people. So it's not just about business and the rich getting richer and all of that kind of nonsense. It's to do with people connecting as human beings and actually learning from each other and flourishing together. And that can happen in cities as well as kind of more remote areas. It's just when it comes to that subject, it's about whether the companies want to settle their businesses in those areas. And I'm afraid at the moment that doesn't seem to be the case. Hopefully that will change, but it doesn't seem to be the case. The corporates and medium and small size companies still want to be where the activity is. And at the moment, that's in the main busy areas, mainly cities.
Vrinda, is there an opportunity here for businesses to start building, collaboration hubs in rural areas, workspaces where people can go and take advantage of really good broadband and Wi-Fi and hot drinks and facilities and a bit more human interaction, outside of the city?
I mean, I think definitely yes. We see that some of the offices do set up their satellite wings or satellite offices, from away from the city center. And really, if the offices are moving away from the city center, or even if they're not, assume they're in the city center, but now I have to go and commute that long distance for those 2 to 3 days. But then, have a bigger space, say outside New York City, where I can have more than one bedroom, or say a swimming pool, which probably, you cannot have in the middle of New York City or in the middle of London, for example. And then when, for example, if people move outside, then retail will prop up. And probably more amenities will pop up. So really, I think in the long run, we have to probably think about, what is really a city center.
Ben, I want to ask you, do you feel the battle has been won? I mean, you've been campaigning on this. Do you think bosses now accept that people can work from home and employees can be trusted to do a really good job from their kitchen?
By and large, I think it's going to take time for that to really take shape. I mean, I think some Microsoft research was mentioned that there is still this productivity paranoia. I think something like 87% of workers are reporting that they're just as, if not more, productive, but only 12% of bosses agree. I'd just also like to address what my friends were saying about loneliness and connection. So a common mistake that's made in these conversations is to equate remote work with lockdown-imposed home working, which is what took place during the pandemic, and you explained the burnout that can come from that. Obviously, that was a very unique situation where we were all forced to work from home under duress. That's not representative of what remote can or should be. But also equating remote work with work from home. Right? Remote work doesn't necessarily mean working from home. So we conducted a study, which was the first ever study of workplace loneliness that took into account data from non-home remote work environments. And what we found was that co-working spaces were actually significantly more socially fulfilling than offices. And so if we want to address this problem, we should look at what the data-driven solutions are, and co-working would be one of them.
Phil, it seems working from home in some form is here to stay. I mean, there's got to be a happy balance somewhere along the line to keep everyone on board, hasn't there?
Yeah, and I think the answer there is quality. So office is not gone. It's that we want better offices, or we need better and more flexible workspaces. In the US alone, there's been more than 100 million square feet of net occupancy growth in office space since the beginning of the pandemic in new properties, so new build. There are multiple planning applications, multiple sites under construction just down the street here in London that are all anchored from major law firms, financial firms, and the like, who are upgrading their space. They may be downsizing, but they are upgrading their space and paying top of the line for that. We've had the first instances of $200 square foot rents in the US. We're seeing routine increases in prime rents in Europe. So people will come in if there's a reason for them to come in and they actually enjoy where they are and it meets their needs for wellness.
Simon, Vrinda, Ben and Phil, thank you for joining us remotely and in person on Roundtable. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on your YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.